Hi everyone, this is the first lecture of week 6, and again you can listen to this as an audio, and please read Genesis 31 before you listen to this lecture. When we left off, things were coming to a head as Jacob was increasingly growing prosperous and rich while working for Laban, but yet was desirous to go back to the land of Canaan, the promised land. When we begin Genesis 31, we find out that Jacob's growing prosperity has led to jealousy and anger by Laban's own sons. Okay, what the biblical writer makes clear here is that despite Jacob's residency in Laban's house, and despite both his wives being Laban's daughters, that Jacob's family cannot merge with or become absorbed into that of Laban, that this would be a threat to the Abrahamic promise. Okay, certainly the biblical text hints that the Arameans, right, Laban's descendants, are related to, are family, part of the family of Jacob's descendants of Israel. Okay, but of course, along with that, there's this hint that the two countries need to remain distinct. Okay. There are also hints if Laban is a kind of symbol of Aram. What we know is that Aram was the bigger, stronger, more powerful country. Okay, indeed, in the story in 2 Kings, we find out that there's an Aramean general who actually has an Israelite slave girl telling you how much more powerful Aram was, right? So maybe part of the reason why you have these stories about Aram being part of the family of Israel is to kind of medio incorporate them, a stronger nation, neighboring nation, into the family of Israel without actually blending them in, without having them fully absorbed. Okay. Now, because of these family tensions in the family of Laban, Jacob has a secret meeting with his wives, Rachel and Leah, where Jacob, goes over the history of Laban's misdeeds, how their father keeps ripping him off and cheating him, and how despite all of this, God has allowed Jacob to prosper. Okay. Jacob also tells Rachel and Leah, his wives, that God has told him to return to the land of Canaan. Okay, the promised land, and that it is incumbent, therefore, that they need to go. And his daughters, the wives of Jacob, also, they echo Jacob's sentiments, right? They feel, we are told that they too feel like they've been mistreated by their father, of course, understandable considering how they ended up both being wives of the same man. And we are told that in Genesis 31, verse 14, they answer in one voice saying this. Then Rachel and Leah answered him, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has been using the money given for us, and all the property that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you." Okay. So notice how everyone is in complete agreement. They need to get out of there. Okay, so what they decide to do, the family of Jacob, is to run for it, right? That is to flee. Okay, why do they need to flee, you may ask? Well, okay, notice that Jacob is a kind of servant, or maybe an indentured servant of Laban somehow. Okay, he's a kind of manager. Okay, moreover, as we know, his wives are Laban's daughters. Okay, so you have a situation here where it is not clear whether his wives, that is Jacob's wives, and Jacob's children really belong to Jacob, or whether in this agreement they are Laban's, right? It's not clear whether Jacob is not a servant or a slave of some sort. Okay, that he has to flee seems to indicate that Laban actually does have a rightful claim to the wives, children, and even property of Jacob's. Okay, and indeed Laban says as much when he finally catches up with them. Okay, now whatever the reason, the family decides to flee, but Rachel, right, decide that she is not going to leave empty-handed. Indeed, instead, like her husband, Rachel thieves something that does not belong to her. And we are told in verse 19, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. This is the Teraphim. And Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. Okay, so we are told that Rachel steals her father's Teraphim, translated here as household gods. Okay, and as we'll see later in this chapter, Laban is, for some reason, very, very upset at this. Okay, so what are teraphim, and why does Rachel do this? Why does she take these things? Okay, now teraphim were small humanoid human-shaped idols. Okay, sometimes they were small, as you see here. Other times we are told they're a little bigger, maybe small person size. And scholars are not sure what the teraphim were or what their significance was. Okay, some say that the teraphim were ancestral figures connected to lineage or inheritance, or maybe worshipped as part of an ancestral cult. Okay, others link them to divination. Okay, so therefore, some have proposed that Rachel steals the teraphim to maybe divine things, right? Or maybe to thieve the headship of the family, or maybe just to make her father angry. I mean, it's not clear, right? Without knowing exactly what the teraphim were and what the significance of these objects were, we don't really know why she steals them. Okay? The text, however, is clear that they are of some significance to Laban, as he brings them up again when he catches up with them. And indeed, we find out that after finding out that Jacob's family has fled, right, that Laban and his men, notice how threatening all this is, rush to catch up with him, which they do, right? And when he reaches them, he tells them that he is within his rights to harm Jacob, right, for doing this illegal thing, which is running. But that luckily for Jacob, God has come to him in a dream to warn him to leave Jacob alone. Okay, and again, notice the portrayal of God in the patriarchal narratives as a family God, a God of the fathers, a God who really is concerned with the protection and prosperity of a very particular family. Right? And indeed, at the end of this whole story, right, Laban and Israel will cut a treaty, right, agreeing to certain boundaries and therefore formally setting the two families apart. Okay? However, before that happens, Laban, when he catches up to Jacob, brings up again his missing teraphim, and he seems to be particularly upset by this. And this is in verse 30. Okay, even though you had to go because you long greatly for your father's house, why did you steal my gods? And Jacob answered Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. But anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. In the presence of our kinsfolk, point out what I have of yours that I've taken. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So notice what happens. Not knowing of Rachel's theft, Jacob unintentionally and tragically curses his favorite wife, his beloved Rachel. Okay, in Genesis 31:32, saying, anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. And this is really tragic because, as I noted earlier, curses are spoken, words are spoken aloud, are seen as having a kind of life of their own. Once uttered, they cannot be, retracted. They return back fulfilled. And this curse, therefore, sets up for Rachel's death not long after this incident, right? Indeed, Rachel will not make it to the promised land, but will die, en route. Okay? And she will be, for some reason, again, be the only matriarch not buried in the Machpelah. And I think one of the articles that I have, either optional or what, explains why she may be not buried there. Okay. Now, how the curse comes to pass or comes to be fulfilled is hinted at what happens next in this chapter. Okay, and what we're told is that Laban goes from tent to tent searching for his missing teraphim. Again, showing you how important they were to him. It states in Genesis 31, verse 34, the following. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. And Laban felt all about in the tent, but did not find it. And she said to her father, let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of the woman is upon me. The way of the woman is, of course, a euphemism for the menstrual cycle, for menstruation. And certainly part of the point of the story, right, is to talk about how stupid idols are, right? Or, fancy word for this, to convey an iconic polemic, right? that is, there's an anti-iconic sentiment here where the Israelite writers and editors are making fun of idols by depicting somebody sitting on them, maybe even bleeding on them. Okay. However, there's probably there's another meaning, another foreshadowing here. Okay, a kind of really masterful detail that adds to the complexity and tragedy of this story. Okay, so think about the image created here. Okay, Rachel says that she cannot get up to greet her father because she is on her period, and whether this is true or not, she is saying this while sitting on a teraphim, which, as I've explained, are small humanoid, human-looking like idols. So we have a woman squatting or sitting on a small humanoid object while bleeding. So think about that image. And now think about what happens to Rachel 4 chapters later en route to the promised land. And this is Genesis 35, verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel was in childbirth, and she had a hard labor. When she was in her hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for now you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she died, she named him Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin or Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar at her grave. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Like so many women in the ancient world, and still our own, in the US has terrible rates for this, and of course they are racially based, right? Rachel dies while giving birth, okay? And the pain and distress she feels from the difficult birth is evident by the first name that she gives her newly born son as she is dying, right? Benoni, and Benoni means son of my sorrow or son of my pain, which is a terrible name if you think about it. Jacob, her husband, understandably changes his name, it's not a good name, to Benjamin or Benjamin, okay, which means son of the right or son of my right side. And as we might talk about later, right and left were imbued with opposing symbolic meanings. The right side was the right side, right? It was good, okay, it was right. The left side was the opposite, okay. The double names here, some scholars also think might reflect or signal the royal status of Benjamin, and Benjamin will be the tribe which will produce the first Israelite king, King Saul. Okay, so there may be something else also being alluded to here. Okay, several aspects add to the tragedy of Rachel's demise. Right. So first is the fact that Rachel dies in childbirth. And notice how tragic this is when her story for so long has centered on her infertility and her desire to have children, especially in competition with her sister Leah. Okay. Second, there are strong hints here that Rachel's death is connected to her theft of the Teraphim and therefore Jacob's unwitting curse. Okay. Notice that the image of Rachel sitting on a small humanoid object while bleeding looks like and therefore seems to be connected to giving birth to a child, which is, this is the exact same image. And of course, this is how she dies by giving birth, okay? Hence, the story of Jacob and Rachel at the end turns into really a kind of tragic love story, where Jacob inadvertently induces the death of his favorite wife. And poor Rachel is seen as wanting children so much that she ends up dying for it, okay? And underneath all of this might be a kind of dark message about favoritism, especially within the family. Right? Notice how favoritism can many times leads to tragic results. We saw it first with Cain and Abel, okay, but also with Jacob and Esau. Okay? The unfair love of parents, and notice the kind of dominoes falling chain reaction that favoritism leads to. Okay, so Rebecca loves Jacob or favors Jacob. Okay, therefore she helps him thieve the blessing. This leads to Jacob fleeing from Esau. Right, this leads to Jacob being forced to marry both his cousins. Right, as comeuppance. Now Jacob's own favoritism of his wife seems to lead to God's increasing the fertility of one wife over against the other wife, right? This what probably encourages Rachel's desperation, okay? And of course, this leads to finally her death, right? So notice that the favoritism leads to a lot of family fracturing. Okay. In short, the biblical text shows how favoritism has mixed, sometimes terrible results. And in showing this, you do wonder whether the biblical writers are wrestling with the idea of being chosen or the idea of election, which is a kind of divine favoritism of Israel. Okay. Being divinely favored, the writers seem to say, is no laughing matter, right? It might even lead to jealousy and hatred from unchosen brothers and sisters or nations. Okay, it might lead to the chosen being targeted and killed as a result. Okay? And then saying that the message of the Hebrew Bible bleeds into the history of the Jewish people, much of which has been tragic and bittersweet. Almost as tragic and bittersweet as Jacob's loss of his favorite wife, his other half, his twin Rachel.